Hi guys, this is Middle Child and I am John Edward Willey, and today I'm just taking a little walk and reflecting on the question, what is philosophy? You know, philosophy is one of the most important things to me, except that I don't think about it as a thing in itself so much as I identify with the philosophical mode of being in the world. And you know, with any question, anytime you're asking about any question of which there's a general agreement on the definition, you'll find that there's a set of cliches explaining what it is, and philosophy is certainly one of those. You can listen to 100 different lectures that are introductory courses into philosophy. You can read various books, and so you'll discover a set number of introductory comments, all of which I'll bypass here, because philosophy is a personal thing to me. I don't think philosophy is something that you do in yourself. I think that philosophizing depends upon a particular kind of dialogue or dialectic with another. Ideally, someone who's perhaps smarter than you or better than you or who can teach you, but ultimately, ideally, someone who's different than you, someone whose otherness, whose strangeness ultimately helps you clarify your own identity. And so I think that although philosophy is personal to me, my own philosophy has depended upon conversations with others, especially those that I disagree with. And conversations that are done in a relatively civil manner are conversations that are in many ways philosophical. But on the other hand, one has to sort of also work against many of the ideas that people have about philosophy. And one of those common ideas that many people think, perhaps without even knowing they think, is that philosophy is a dead subject. I don't think it is. I think that there's a sense in which when it's taught, it's often taught in such a way that I've frequently met people who never had a philosophical thought after taking a course, or who were turned away from philosophy. Now, of course, there are some who have the right teacher or have the right experience, and so discover themselves to be philosophical in whatever way. But I think the tendency in a lot of people is to teach philosophy without philosophizing. You see, to me, that's a key difference. There are philosophers who philosophize in a way where they're explaining ideas, or they're asking questions in a relatively pedantic manner so as to go about explaining them in such a way that the student or listener can at least get a sense of what philosophy is. But that's not the kind of philosophy that I identify with. I understand its role, but the philosophy I identify with is one that philosophizes. And so that means that you just pull the listener or reader in to a back and forth. And that's what I seek to do. And I do it within myself in such a way that to philosophize means to ultimately participate in a process wherein you're sustaining various differing points of views and even values and systems of belief and mythologies and paradigms, and practicing a certain kind of what's called cognitive dissonance, insofar as you're learning how to sustain multiple points of view at once, and not to do so in such a way where it's neat and tidy and you have a kind of control over what you say. But in many ways, to philosophize is to lose that control, because to philosophize induces a kind of vertigo. I mean, there's a sense of relative helplessness that some people experience, akin to trying out drugs and then deciding they're never going to do that drug ever again. Well, there's a sense in which when philosophy isn't, I guess, taught or introduced in the right way, it can fail to ignite in the listener or student that flame. It's a flame that keeps itself alive. And it's a flame that does so not merely by reading philosophical books or merely talking to people, but what's most important is ultimately testing out those ideas. So you philosophize as a way of clarifying your own beliefs and values and attitudes, but living is instrumental as a way of testing out or living out those very ideas and ideals. And so you find that you can read a book and then live a little, and then you read the book again and it's as if the book changed, you know. But Plato and Kant and Heidegger, they don't change. Their books are finished. It's we who change in relation. And what it is that's changing in relation oftentimes is an unconscious set of presuppositions and assumptions that are shaping your various your experience of the world. And I'm not an idealist, and I'm not a subjectivist or a solipsist, and I'm not a mystical person. I have very little affinity with New Age movements, but I do think that there's a degree to which philosophizing means in many ways thinking critically, not in the sense of dealing with metaphysics or dealing with politics or these sort of grandiose subjects of which many people think philosophy is about. I think, to quote one of my favorite people, who is what's called a situationist, his name is Raoul Vaneigem. I think I'm mispronouncing his name, but he wrote a book called The Revolution of Everyday Life. And although there's something ironic about it, given where it comes from and what it ultimately means, but I do think it ignited in me a sense in which to philosophize isn't merely to entertain others, and it's not merely to offer an ornamentation, in the sense that philosophy is not a dead subject. It's not a museum subject. So to philosophize is to keep alive a particular kind of spirit that isn't doing so merely as a way of impressing others. Ultimately, what you're doing is challenging your own inward hidden ideas and ideals and living through them, and then discovering that this process sort of never ends, but that the role of philosophy isn't superficial. It's actually to help you change your life, and you change your life from the inside out. Now, of course, that sort of leads to the classic remark made by Marx in regards to the nature of philosophies. I think he said something like, hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world. But the point, however, is to change it. And for a lot of us, it activated a certain reserve within us, that its rhetorical ability, I can see now, activated a certain quasi-anti-intellectualism that's always latent and always potentially present, especially in particular socioeconomic conditions, i.e. the conditions from which Marx arises. Perhaps they felt there was no need and no time to think, but I'm no Heideggerian, but I think that Heidegger had something to say about that, insofar as there is a degree to which we are caught up in what is sometimes called a hermeneutic circle, and I'm not really smart enough to even explain what that is, but in philosophy I know it means something like the fact that our interpretations are fundamental to how we act, and how we act is fundamental to our interpretation, in the sense that there's a circularity that demands that if there is such a thing as praxis or putting philosophy into action, there's also something to be said for the hesitation and sort of detachment that comes with philosophy. And there's a sense in which we don't have the kind of understanding that we would like to have, in spite of our very best efforts. And if understanding is related to control, then although we've reshaped the world, there's a level at which we don't have control because we don't have understanding. And so on a certain level, that's where philosophy begins. It's an examination of that invisible foundation, whatever it is. And it's not a neat and tidy process. I mean, it's relatively messy. And it demands not only the study of books and conversations, as I've said, and the living out of your ideas and living up to your ideas and seeing the degree to which your ideas are true. I mean, there's no other way around it. However, there's a kind of humility that comes along with this, in the sense that you begin to discover both beautiful things and potentially tragic things, because there is a sense in which the more you understand and the more you know, it really means knowing how little we know and how little we understand. But it also means that this little bit of understanding and this little bit of knowing actually can go quite a long way. So that's why I mentioned earlier, I'm not the kind of philosopher who begins with a kind of subjectivism or anything like that. I'm the kind of philosopher who tries to begin with the reality of life. And I'm not a Heideggerian, but I think Heidegger had some important things to say about what he called facticity, or what he called thrownness, because we're thrown into life. And there's a sense in which we're wrestling with particular realities and truths, of which these are not questions. There are things that, to follow Nietzsche's line of thought, we have to affirm. And so there's a sense in which perhaps there's like an irrelevance to philosophy. And there's a relative degree of pointlessness to it, because in so many ways it is like twiddling your thumbs. There's something, you have to be relatively self-aware to philosophize, if you're going to philosophize in life and live your life, because there is something pointless about it, especially as I've mentioned, I think in my first videos. There's a certain sense in which that's precisely the point at which philosophy has led us. If you take David Hume seriously, I think, and then you examine, the state of theory in the 21st century, you discover that in many ways we're at a crossroads. We're at a place in which, sorry, that was a technical error, but the thing that I was trying to say about philosophy has to do with a handful of things that I think that I've tried to convey so far, but what I mean to impart is this notion that it is relevant and it is crucial. And if we're going to ask questions as big as the situation that we face, then we have to first affirm the situation and affirm ourselves. And we have to ask questions in such a way where we're first asking questions like, what is a good question? Questions that are so fundamental we think they go without examination, such as questions regarding our values and our beliefs. And it's in a participatory process with other people where we discover what we don't think. And there's a sense in which we have the courage to ask ourselves these questions. We discover that we, in many ways, don't know what we think. But in living through our lives and testing ideas and living without the kind of certainty that a lot of people need, you will become a philosophical person, insofar as what's ultimately at stake is your own interiority. And to a lot of people, that's just an imaginary thing, and perhaps it is, because it is just a word. But I think it refers to something that is so easily overlooked by various sides and philosophical perspectives. And it has to do with the very shape of our subjectivity in relation to the immediate world around us. And so a lot of philosophy has to do with the question of subjectivity and objectivity. And these at first seem very arcane. They seem very obtuse, very irrelevant. But after 20 years of participating in this process in my own way, I've come to find that these everyday distinctions and ideas, the things that everybody agrees on, are actually the things that, once you question them, you might discover a radically different view of the world. Of course, it only comes through a radical displacement and a radical vertigo, as I mentioned. But there's a sense in which what I'm trying to get at, and what was supposed to be my first point, has to do with the fact that to be philosophical may have something to do with a temperament or a personality, because if there is no privileged place wherein one can have some view from nowhere regarding reality and things, then in many ways, many philosophers are actually sort of secretive attempts to claim a place from nowhere, to claim a certain objective view. And yet, that in itself, in many ways, is just trying to give themselves power. And that's something I resist. And it's something that I resist insofar as I don't philosophize with other people unless they're sort of like me. Because there's a phrase that David Hume, I believe it was his doctor who diagnosed him after David Hume had a nervous breakdown, and the diagnosis was that he had the disease of the learned. And the disease of the learned was really, in many ways, the intellectual temperament, because to be an intellectual means to be perpetually restless. And that restlessness is something that can throw your whole life off. It can make everything go sideways. It can make it, in many ways, uncomfortable for other people. So there's a sense in which you have to live with others, and you have to have a kind of pluralistic sense of what the world is and what philosophy means. And so perhaps that's why it's beautiful to have something online like YouTube or podcast, wherein there can be what used to be called a republic of letters, the Republic of Letters being a kind of network in Europe that links scientists and scholars and writers in the 17th and 18th century in such a way that that network in itself allowed them to participate in a philosophical process that ultimately created the world around us. And so perhaps even this is an extension of that. And you could say that if the situations in the world are radically contingent, then we must have a way of being in the world that can play with and endure that radical contingency. And I go so far as to put philosophy's name up, if not poetry as well, but that's subject for another video. So I'm just trying to explain a little bit of what I think philosophy is, and so this is sort of the one of many videos I'll make in regards to what I think of as ontologia, which is what other people might think of as philosophy, the love of wisdom. This is Middle Child signing off.